I spent 35 years building something from nothing, and when I finally let it go, I thought the hardest part of my life was behind me. I was wrong. My name is Robert Marsh. I turned 64 last March. For most of my adult life, I ran a mid-sized manufacturing company out of Columbus, Ohio. Industrial components, nothing glamorous, but the kind of work that keeps bridges standing and machines running. I started with a second-hand lathe in a rented garage on the east side of town, and I ended with 212 employees, 3 facilities, and a reputation that took 3 decades to build. When the acquisition offer came in from a private equity group out of Chicago, my attorney told me to sleep on it. I slept on it for about 4 minutes. $6.8 million. After taxes, after fees, after everything, I walked away with just under $4.5 million. My attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Holt, who had been with me since the early days, told me I was set for life if I was careful. I told her I planned to be very careful. The closing happened on a Tuesday in late September. That Friday, I took my son Daniel and his wife Sandra to dinner at the Meridian, the nicest restaurant in Columbus. White tablecloths, a sommelier who actually knew what he was talking about. The kind of place where the menu doesn't have prices, because if you have to ask, you probably shouldn't be there. I'd made a reservation 2 weeks in advance. I wanted to celebrate with my family. Daniel was 38. He worked in commercial real estate, had been moderately successful at it, and had married Sandra 6 years earlier. She was pleasant enough on the surface, attentive, well-dressed, always quick, with a smile that showed all her teeth. I had always told myself that first impressions weren't everything, that Sandra just took some time to warm up to. I had told myself that for 6 years. We ordered appetizers. We ordered wine. The sommelier suggested a bottle that cost more than my first car payment, and I said, why not? Daniel gave a toast. He talked about how proud he was of what I had built, how this moment was the culmination of everything I had sacrificed. Sandra reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said, "You deserve every bit of this, Robert." She called me Robert, never Dad. I had never pushed it. It was a good dinner. It was the kind of dinner I had imagined for years, a quiet celebration with the people who mattered most, at a table that felt like the reward for a lifetime of early mornings and late nights. By the time dessert came, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Real peace. I drove home alone that night. I poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon, sat in the leather chair by the window that looked out over the backyard, and I thought about what came next. Travel. Maybe. I had always wanted to drive the Pacific Coast Highway. Maybe buy a small place in Asheville. Spend summers in the mountains. My wife Margaret had passed 8 years earlier, a sudden stroke that I still wasn't entirely over, and for a long time after that, the future had felt like something that happened to other people. But sitting in that chair with the bourbon and the quiet and $4.5 million in a brokerage account, the future finally started to look like something I might actually want to step into. That feeling lasted about 6 weeks. The call came on a Wednesday morning in mid-November. I was having coffee when my phone rang. The number was local, and when I answered, I recognized the voice immediately. It was Gerald Foote. Gerald had been my company accountant for 22 years. I had kept him on part-time to help with my personal finances, even after the sale. He was 61, meticulous, the kind of man who alphabetized his spice cabinet and balanced his checkbook to the penny. I trusted him completely. "Robert," he said, and there was something in his voice I had never heard before, a hesitation, like he was choosing his words with unusual care. "I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll understand why I'm asking directly instead of going through anyone else." I set my coffee down. "Go ahead, Gerald." "Last week, Daniel came into my office. He said you had asked him to discuss some changes to your financial management structure. He had a document with him, a general durable power of attorney. He said you'd signed it last month." I remember the exact moment the room got quiet. Not silent, I could still hear the refrigerator hum, still hear a car passing outside, but something inside me went completely still. "He showed me the document?" I said. "He did. He said you wanted him to have full authority over your financial affairs going forward. given that you'd mentioned being overwhelmed by the complexity of managing the sale proceeds. He wanted to discuss moving your primary brokerage holdings into a joint account structure that he would manage. I had never signed a power of attorney. I had never asked Daniel to manage anything. I had never told anyone I was overwhelmed. I had not had that conversation with my son. I had not had any version of that conversation with anyone. "Gerald," I said, "I didn't sign anything." The silence on his end lasted exactly 3 seconds. "I was afraid of that," he said quietly. I asked him to hold the document. I asked him not to say anything to Daniel, not to move forward with anything, and not to tell anyone about this conversation. Gerald said he understood completely. He also told me that Daniel had mentioned he was planning to visit Patricia Holt's office the following week to discuss estate restructuring. Patricia was my attorney. She handled everything. I hung up the phone and sat very still for a long time. There is a particular kind of pain that comes when the people you love betray you. It is different from other kinds of pain. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles in slow and cold, like fog coming in off a lake at dawn. And by the time you realize how thick it has gotten, you can't see anything clearly anymore. I had built my entire adult life around providing for my family. After Margaret died, Daniel was all I had left. I had given him everything: private school, a college education at Ohio State, the down payment on his first house, interest-free loans when his real estate deals went sideways. I had never once asked for anything in return except to know that he was okay. I thought about the way Sandra had put her hand over mine at dinner. "You deserve every bit of this, Robert." I thought about Daniel's toast, proud of what I had built, the culmination of everything I had sacrificed. I thought, how long have you been planning this? I did not call Daniel. I did not call Sandra. I did not react, which was perhaps the hardest thing I had ever done in my life. Instead, I called Patricia Holt. Patricia answered on the second ring. When I told her what Gerald had told me, she didn't say a word for almost 10 seconds. Then she said, "Robert, I need you to come in today. This afternoon, if possible." I was at her office by 2 o'clock. What Patricia told me over the next 2 hours changed the way I understood the previous year of my life. A durable power of attorney, if properly executed, gives the named agent broad legal authority over the principal's financial and medical decisions. A forged one, if not challenged immediately, can do significant damage before anyone catches it. Patricia had received a voicemail from Daniel 3 weeks earlier before my closing, before the money even hit my accounts, asking about the process for helping an aging parent manage complex financial assets. She had assumed it was a general inquiry. She had not yet returned the call. She showed me the voicemail transcript her assistant had prepared. The exact wording was, "My father is having some difficulty keeping track of everything since the sale. We want to make sure we can step in and help if things get complicated." I had never expressed any difficulty to anyone. My mind was sharp. My doctors had told me at my last physical that I was in excellent health for my age, better than excellent. I ran 3 miles 3 times a week. I read 2 books a month. I did the crossword every morning. "He's building a narrative," Patricia said. She had her reading glasses on and her hands folded on the desk in front of her, and she looked at me with the direct steadiness she'd had for 30 years. A paper trail suggesting cognitive decline. If he can establish that pattern and then produce a signed power of attorney, even a forged one, he has a window to move assets before anyone challenges it. "How long would that window be?" I asked. "Long enough," she said. "Especially if he moves fast." I asked her what she needed from me. She gave me a list. Over the next 3 weeks, I moved quietly and methodically. I did not change my behavior around Daniel or Sandra. I still answered Daniel's calls. I still had Sunday dinners at their house on the weeks he invited me. I sat across the table from my son and his wife and ate Sandra's pot roast and talked about football and the weather and whether the housing market was going to correct in the spring. I smiled. I asked Sandra about her sister's new baby. I let Daniel refill my glass of iced tea, and the entire time I was watching everything. Patricia retained a private investigator named Charles Webb, a former Columbus PD detective who had worked financial fraud cases for 15 years before going private. Charles was 56, quiet, methodical, and thorough in a way that reminded me of Gerald. He didn't editorialize. He gathered facts, and he reported them. What he found was worse than I had prepared myself for. Daniel and Sandra had, over the course of approximately 14 months, constructed a careful and deliberate plan to gain control of my assets. It had started, according to the documents Charles obtained, roughly 8 months before my company sale closed, around the time the acquisition offer became serious, and the number attached to my name grew large enough to be worth planning around. The forged power of attorney was real. Charles tracked the notary stamp to a woman named Brenda Coates, a notary public in Dublin, a suburb of Columbus, who had a prior relationship with Sandra through a yoga studio they both attended. Brenda Coates had notarized a document without witnessing my signature technically that was already a serious problem, and the signature on the document was close to mine, but not mine. I had signed thousands of contracts over 35 years. I knew my own signature. Patricia had a handwriting analyst confirm it, but the document was only part of it. Charles discovered that Daniel had, over the previous 6 months, been consulting with a geriatric care attorney in a neighboring county, not in Franklin County, where I lived, specifically so the consultations would be harder to trace through local professional networks. The attorney's name was Lawrence Pruitt. Daniel had paid Pruitt $4,000 in 2 installments for consultations regarding, as Pruitt's billing records described it, proactive management of elder family members' estate in anticipation of capacity concerns. I read that phrase 3 times. Capacity concerns. My son had been paying an attorney to help him build a case that his 64-year-old, fully functioning father lacked the mental capacity to manage his own affairs. I also learned, through bank records Charles obtained, that Daniel's real estate business had been in serious trouble for the better part of 2 years. 3 deals had fallen through in succession. He was carrying debt on 2 investment properties that were hemorrhaging money. His personal accounts showed a pattern of large transfers to cover business losses, and by the month of my company's sale closing, his liquid assets were under $30,000. Sandra had stopped working the previous spring, citing stress. They were drowning, and they had looked at me and seen a life raft. I sat with all of this for 3 days before I let myself feel anything. That was something I had learned in business when the stakes were highest. Emotion was the most expensive luxury you could afford. I made myself think clearly before I let myself feel. I read through every document. I asked Patricia and Charles questions until I had no more questions to ask. I built a complete picture of what my son and his wife had done and what they had intended to do. Then I drove out to the reservoir on the east side of the city, the one where I used to take Daniel fishing when he was 9 and 10 years old. I sat on the hood of my truck for a while, and I looked at the water. It was late November, and the trees were bare, and the water was gray and very still. I thought about the summers we had spent at that reservoir. Daniel in a life jacket, small enough that the jacket came up to his chin, dropping his fishing line in with complete seriousness, like catching a bass was the most important task in the world. I thought about the way he used to run to me when he scraped his knee, the absolute certainty in the way he would reach for my hand in a parking lot without even looking, just knowing I was there. I had been there every single time. I wondered when that had changed. I wondered if it had changed all at once, or slowly, incrementally, in ways neither of us had noticed until it was too late to go back. I didn't find any answers at the reservoir. I don't think I expected to, but I sat there long enough that the cold came through my jacket, and when I finally got back in the truck and drove home, I had made up my mind about what came next. The first thing I did was have Patricia file a preemptive legal challenge to the power of attorney document, citing fraud and forgery. This was filed quietly, in a way that didn't generate immediate public notice, but created a clear, time-stamped legal record. If Daniel ever attempted to act on the document, he would hit a wall. The second thing I did was restructure my financial accounts entirely. Patricia had referred me to an independent wealth management firm in Cincinnati, far enough from Columbus that Daniel had no relationships there. Over the course of 10 days, I moved the entirety of my liquid assets into a carefully constructed, irrevocable trust. I was the sole beneficiary during my lifetime. The trustee was Patricia, not Daniel, not anyone connected to Daniel. The terms of the trust included a very specific provision. Any person who initiated legal proceedings attempting to challenge my mental competency, access my assets through any form of legal authority, or assert any claim against the trust would be automatically and permanently excluded from any future inheritance. Patricia had drafted that language herself. She called it the unambiguous clause. I called it the only thing I'd said in months that made me feel something other than grief. The third thing I did was commission a full neuropsychological evaluation. 3 separate evaluations, actually, from 3 separate physicians, each conducted independently. All 3 returned identical conclusions. No signs of cognitive decline, no memory impairment, no indicators of capacity compromise of any kind. Patricia had all 3 reports certified and filed in multiple jurisdictions. If Daniel or his attorney ever put the word incompetent in any legal document, they would be facing a wall of medical evidence so comprehensive it would take years to dismantle years and hundreds of thousands of dollars they didn't have. I did all of this in 47 days. From the morning Gerald called me to the morning everything was in place. I did it without Daniel knowing. I did it without changing a single thing about how I behaved around him. I had Sunday dinner at his house 4 times during those 47 days. I want to say something about those dinners, because I think they were the hardest part of all of it. There is a thing that happens when you know the truth about someone, and they don't know you know it. You sit across from them and you watch their face, and you listen to their voice, and you try to reconcile the person you see with the thing they've done. You look for it, some sign in the eyes, some micro-expression, some moment where the mask slips, and you see what's underneath. I looked for it at every dinner. Sometimes I thought I found it in the way Sandra watched me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. A quiet, calculating assessment that lasted only a second before she smiled. Sometimes I thought I found it in the way Daniel talked about my plans for the money. Always casually, always framed as concern. Have you thought about what you're going to do with the Asheville idea, Dad? You don't want to sink too much into property right now. The advice of a loving son, or the advice of a man mapping the terrain he intended to take. I stopped trying to figure out which it was. People are complicated. Greed is not a switch that flips. It grows the way most things grow slowly, in the dark, fed by pressure and fear, and the particular kind of moral erosion that happens when you tell yourself, just this once, that what you want matters more than what's right. I had seen it in business. I had seen good people I liked and respected, do things under financial pressure that they would have found unthinkable in easier times. I didn't think Daniel was born without a conscience. I thought he had slowly learned to ignore it, one small compromise at a time, until the thing he was planning no longer felt to him like what it actually was. That didn't make it forgivable, but it made it comprehensible. And comprehensible, I had learned, was the only thing that kept grief from turning into something worse. The confrontation happened on a Saturday in early January. I chose the location deliberately. My house, not his. The house I had lived in for 27 years, the house where Daniel had grown up, the house where Margaret had died in the bedroom upstairs. My territory, my terms. I called Daniel on a Thursday and asked if he and Sandra could come over Saturday afternoon. I said I wanted to talk about some plans I was making, get his thoughts on a few things. He said, of course, they'd be there at 2. He sounded easy and warm. He sounded exactly the way he always sounded. Patricia was there when they arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with her briefcase open and a neat stack of documents in front of her. Charles was there as well, standing near the hallway. I had asked a neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Earl who had lived next door for 20 years, to be present as a witness. He sat quietly in the corner of the living room with his hands folded in his lap. Daniel and Sandra came through the front door and stopped when they saw Patricia. Sandra's smile went first. It was fast a fraction of a second, but I was watching for it and I saw it, the exact moment she understood that something had gone wrong with their plan. Daniel looked at me. Dad, what's going on? I asked them to sit down. I didn't yell. I had promised myself I wouldn't yell, and I kept that promise. I spoke in the same tone I had used in 35 years of business negotiations. The tone that Margaret used to say was the most unnerving thing about me, flat and steady and completely without effect. I told them what I knew. I told them about the forged power of attorney. I told them about the consultations with Lawrence Pruitt. I told them about the financial records, the debt, the failed deals, the 14 months of planning. I told them about Gerald's phone call. I told them about the exact Saturday in September when Sandra had put her hand over mine at the Meridian and told me I deserved every bit of it. I watched their faces while I talked. Sandra looked at the table. Daniel looked at me, and his expression went through several things in quick succession: shock, then a kind of careful blankness, then something that might have been shame if it got the chance to fully form. It didn't quite get there. By the time I finished talking, his face had settled into something more defensive than ashamed. "Dad," he started, "you have to understand." "I do understand," I said. "That's the problem." Patricia took over at that point. She walked them through the legal situation in clear and specific terms. The forgery charge was a third-degree felony in Ohio. The preemptive filing meant any action taken on the power of attorney would be immediately actionable. The restructured trust was irrevocable and beyond any legal challenge they could afford. She laid the 3 neuropsychological evaluations on the table in front of them, one at a time, like cards in a hand she had been holding for weeks. Then she told them what I had decided. I was not going to file criminal charges for the forgery. I had thought about that long and hard, and I had decided against it. Not out of weakness, and not entirely out of whatever remained of my love for my son. I had decided against it because Margaret had loved Daniel with her whole heart, and I could not bring myself to put her son in a cell. That was the only mercy I had left to give, and I gave it because it was the last thing in the situation that still belonged to me. But there were conditions. Daniel and Sandra would have no contact with my financial advisors, my attorney, or any of my professional relationships, ever. The trust documents would remain on file with Patricia indefinitely, with the exclusion clause intact. Daniel would acknowledge, in writing, the nature of what he had done, not for any legal purpose, but because I needed it said out loud, on paper, in a form that couldn't be walked back. And they would leave my house and not return unless I specifically invited them. Sandra started to say something. I looked at her once, and she stopped. Daniel signed the acknowledgement. His hand shook slightly. He didn't look at me when he signed it. And when Patricia took the document back, he sat very still for a moment, with his hands flat on the table, like a man who wasn't sure his legs would hold him if he stood. Then he stood up. He looked at me. His eyes were wet, but he didn't cry. And for a second, just a second, I saw the 9-year-old in the life jacket at the reservoir. The kid who used to reach for my hand in parking lots without looking. The absolute and unconditional trust in that gesture. The certainty that I would be there. I had been there. I had always been there. And it had not been enough. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. The words came out quiet and level, and I believed them and didn't believe them at the same time, and I understood that I would probably spend the rest of my life unable to resolve that particular contradiction. I nodded once. They left. Earl walked Patricia and Charles out. I stood alone in my living room in the house I had lived in for 27 years, and I looked at the photographs on the mantelpiece. Margaret on our wedding day, Daniel at his high school graduation, a fishing photo from the reservoir when Daniel was 10, the two of us squinting against the summer sun with a base between us that looked bigger in the photo than it had in real life. I thought about what I expected to feel. I had expected, somewhere in the back of my mind, that this moment would feel like relief, like finishing something, like the clean completion of a chapter that could finally close. It didn't feel like that. It felt like loss. Pure and uncomplicated and very heavy, the kind of loss that doesn't announce itself dramatically but just sits down next to you quietly and makes itself at home. I had not lost my money. I had not lost my freedom or my health or my future. I had lost something harder to name and harder to replace the version of my son I had believed in, the story of my family I had been telling myself for years, the particular peace that comes from knowing with certainty that the people who love you actually love you. I poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon. I sat in the leather chair by the window. Outside, the January yard was frozen and bare, and the last of the afternoon light was going gray across the dead grass. In the months that followed, I did the things I had planned to do before any of this happened. I drove the Pacific Coast Highway in April, alone, and it was everything I had imagined, and also completely different, the way things always are. I bought a small house in Asheville, a place with a porch that looked out at the Blue Ridge and a kitchen big enough to actually cook in. I spent the summer there. I made friends. I learned to slow down in a way that I hadn't known how to do when the business was running, when there was always something that needed my attention, always a problem that was mine to solve. I heard from Daniel once, in May, a letter, handwritten, 3 pages. I read it twice, and I put it in a drawer in my desk in Columbus. I haven't read it since, and I haven't responded. I don't know yet if I will. That particular question is still open, and I've decided that some questions don't need to be forced to a conclusion before they're ready. What I know is this: I spent 35 years building something real, something that created jobs and supported families, and kept machinery running in places I would never see. I built it because I believed that hard work done honestly was worth something, not just the money it produced, but the doing of it, the integrity of the thing itself. That belief is still mine. No one took it from me. No one could. I also know that money reveals things. It doesn't create character or destroy it. It just removes the conditions that allowed certain truths to stay hidden. The pressure that Daniel had been under, the fear of failure, the slow erosion of the choices he had made and the choices he hadn't, those things had been there long before my company sold. The money didn't make my son the person he turned out to be. It just turned the light on. And I know this too, because I've thought about it a great deal in the quiet mornings on the porch in Asheville, with my coffee and the mountains and the unhurried light. What Daniel did, as precise and deliberate as it was, came from a place of desperation. That doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it forgivable in any simple sense. But desperation has a logic of its own. And somewhere inside, the man who forged my signature and paid an attorney to build a case against my mind was the boy who grew up watching me work myself half to death for something I never quite stopped long enough to enjoy. I had given Daniel every material thing I could think to give him. I had paid for his education, his house, his business loans. I had provided with my whole heart. I had not, perhaps, taught him enough about what it looked like to build something of your own, about the particular dignity that comes not from inheriting but from earning. I don't know if that changes anything. I don't know if it distributes any of the responsibility differently or makes what he did even a fraction more understandable. Probably it doesn't. But it keeps me from walking around with nothing but contempt in my chest. And contempt was always the emotion that cost me the most in business. I couldn't afford it then. I can't afford it now. Last October, the first anniversary of the sale closing, I drove back out to the reservoir east of Columbus. It was late afternoon, overcast, the kind of October light that makes everything look like a painting of itself. I sat on the hood of my truck, and I looked at the water for a long time. I didn't feel peace. Exactly. Peace, I've decided, is not a destination. It's not something you arrive at and stay in. It's more like weather. It comes and goes, and the best you can do is notice it when it's there, and not try to hold on to it too hard when it passes. What I felt was something quieter than peace. Steadiness, maybe. The sense of still being upright after something that had every reason to knock me down. The knowledge that the $4.5 million was exactly where I had put it. That my name was still my name. That my mind was still mine. That no one had taken from me the things that actually mattered. That felt like enough. The fishing photo from the reservoir was still on my mantelpiece in Columbus. I'd thought about taking it down after everything, but I hadn't, and I don't think I will. It documents something that was true. A father and a son on a summer afternoon, the light coming off the water, the uncomplicated happiness of a fish and a photograph. That happened. It was real. Whatever came after doesn't undo it. The same way a bad ending doesn't erase everything that came before it. The same way a man can be two contradictory things at once, and both of them be true. I drove back to Asheville that evening. I stopped at a diner outside of Chillicothe and had a bowl of chili and a cup of coffee. And I sat at the counter and talked with the woman working the register about the weather and whether the mountain roads would be icy in another few weeks. She told me she had a son who was learning to drive and was terrified every time he went out. I told her he'd get it, that the fear was just a sign he understood the stakes. She laughed and said that was either the most comforting thing she'd heard all week or the least. I left a $20 tip on a $7 check, and I got back on the highway, and I drove south through the dark toward the mountains and the porch and the particular quiet that had become, against all expectations, my life. It wasn't the life I had planned when I signed those closing documents and poured the bourbon and sat in the leather chair by the window and felt peace for the first time in years. But it was mine, built on work and character, on the truth of what I had done and the truth of what had been done to me, on the stubborn, unglamorous insistence on staying upright when the ground shifted. That was enough. It had always been enough. I just hadn't known it yet.